Hi, welcome to Key Takeaways, the podcast from Murphy Research, where we unpack the insights that drive innovation and success. I'm your host, Maggie Bright, and today we're diving into the X's and O's of innovation sessions, what it takes to create an environment where breakthrough ideas can thrive and you can be an innovation superhero. Joining Chuck and I today is Steve Holmberg, an expert in leading innovation session. He's here to talk about how to set up the sessions for success, from getting the right people into the room to fostering an atmosphere of creativity and collaboration. So if you're in market research, product development, or just looking to spark innovation in your business, this episode is for you. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Maggie Bright from Murphy Research. Thanks so much for joining us for Key Takeaways. I am joined by my usual co-host, Chuck Murphy, and our guest host, Steve Holmberg. Welcome, Steve. Hey, Chuck.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How's everyone doing today?
Yeah, good. Excited.
Excellent. Very excited. We are going to talk a little bit about innovation sessions, and we had the pleasure of working on one with Steve recently, so we hoped that he could come in and add a little more color so you didn't just have to hear Chuck and I, as we usually just drone on. So, Steve, can you tell us a little bit about who you are so our three guests get to know you?
Hi, so happy to be here. Thanks for having me today. A little bit of background on me. I've spent the last 17 years at Nike, but recently left to start my own sort of consulting agency in market research and insights. And during my time at Nike, I spent several years in brand strategy, approximately 8, and then an additional 8 to 9 in some form of consumer research, whether it was decision science and taking consumer data and sharing it with the business, or quant researcher role. And then finally, in my last role, I was in a group called Marketplace Trends. So we took all of the trends that were happening in the industry from a competitive landscape perspective, try to find those white space opportunities, share those with the business, and then try to create change or shift where the company's going. Additionally, on the side, I also teach at the University of Oregon, which is really fun. I teach a consumer research class to a sport product management program, which is a graduate program from them. So it's kind of, I take some of the learnings, then some of what we'll talk about today, and
we have noticed in our industry that we are called upon to be much more than just insights and researchers now. And we're often asked to kind of contribute to strategic recommendations and the innovation pipeline for some of the brands that we work with. And it's such an honor to be able to do that. And it's actually a lot of fun. And it really blends nicely with the skill set that we have, because we have all of these deep insights around the consumers, and we're able to think strategically about how to use them and how to activate them. And so it's a real compliment when companies ask us to come in and help with these types of things. And the way that often manifests itself is in this innovation session. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how we set those up, and what are some of the thinking that goes into them, the guidelines that we try to follow, and then, maybe some highlights and lowlights of our experiences doing them. The one that we recently worked on together was CPG focused, but we've done them across all these different industries, and they're all different. Each one is sort of its own unique beast, but they sort of have some tenets that are the same throughout. And so we're going to kind of generalize what some of those rules and guidelines are, while hopefully bringing in some specific examples that do not violate any of the NDAs that we have all signed. So with that, I realize I haven't let Chuck speak at all yet. So before I start asking questions, Chuck, is there anything you want to add in terms of kind of how we got here and why we're talking about the X's and O's of innovation sessions today?
Sure. And, the less I speak, the better the podcast generally. So probably smart move on your part. But I do think one thing to kind of point out is, like, although when we say innovation session, we're kind of talking about a process, but the target of that innovation session could be a really wide range, right? Like, we could be talking about a product. We could be talking about like a subcategory or blue sky or something like that. We could be talking about communications frameworks. We could talk about communication. So I think it's kind of important to kind of say we use that as a catch-all for our method. But there could be a lot of different things that are being kind of brainstormed or refined or innovated on. So I think it's kind of nice context for this.
Absolutely. So one of
be here talking to you about it.
Yeah, one of my favorite ones we've ever done was around it was a pharmaceutical. It was around insomnia. So like we can do an innovation session on anything. Um, awesome. So the first thing that I really wanted to ask y'all about, and I will of course add my own opinions too, is kind of what in your mind are some of the guidelines that we think about as we set these up. And I'll pose the question to you and let it take you where you want to go with it. But do you have any sort of hard and fast rules that you use as you're setting up these sessions that you think about prior to even walking into the room or collecting insights to lead the session? Steve, I'll throw it to you first. Is there anything that you're like, this has to happen? These are my rules. I don't play the game if these things aren't in place.
Yeah, I have a whole set of rules that I sort of share with students or share in the workshops. But the one that sort of stands out to me is probably the most important is the one that I see trips everybody up the most, which is this idea of judgment and bringing judgment to the table. We as humans are great at judging, and we spend a lot of time judging. But when we're in these sessions, it's really important for us to keep that open mind and expansionary thinking and try to get people to have that same sort of ideas and move into building on people's ideas rather than sort of shutting them down or shutting down even your own ideas. So one of the rules I sort of share is this is a no judgment zone. There's going to be lots of time to judge later when we sort of narrow down different topics, but when in that expansionary thinking portion of the module, it's really important to be able to have that build, and it only happens sort of without judgment. So that's one of the key ones.
I'm going to piggyback on your judgment one because that is my number one rule as well. And there are two things that I sort of add on to that. One being that even if you think something is a bad idea, and I do believe there are no bad ideas, but often that idea that you judge yourself as bad is the spark for someone else's idea that's really relevant or compelling. And as you think about the chain reaction that ideas have, you never know sort of what the origin of that is. And it could be this idea that you're like, I don't know if I want to share that. And so I often think that one idea sparks another idea, and therefore all ideas are relevant in the context of the expansion phase. And then the other one that I have that sort of piggybacks on that is this idea of a lot of times it's not only judgment that people bring, but sort of past experiences. So we have to do it this way, or it's always been done this way, or the business dictates that it is this way. And so that's the other thing. I ask you to leave sort of like your preconceived notions of how things have been or the status quo, like at the door. There's time to come back and add that lens later, because obviously there are often business constraints that we have to factor in. But in this sort of innovation or expansion phase, like leaving the past behind is a good thing, so that new ideas can emerge. So I love that.
Yeah, can I ask a question about that? Because what do you do to help get people expand outside of that thinking, or try to break their everyday knowledge and sort of?
I think there's a couple of ways to do it. I think first is, very blatantly stating like, hey, there's room for all ideas, and saying that, we're not going to judge you. So making people feel comfortable. I think one of the other ones that's important, and it works in combination with a lot of things, is the way that you set up the exercises. They have to sometimes be creative and oftentimes quirky almost, so that people can sort of be jogged out of their everyday thinking. And a lot of times participants are like, why do you care what I would bring to a desert island if I were stuck there for 3 days? But often it's sort of those first initial, almost even icebreaker exercises that sort of break that sort of routine thinking. And so I think a lot of that's part of it. And then I also think the people in the room matter, right? So if you have people who come from different perspectives or different, a combination of introverts and extroverts and research people and insights people and creatives and marketing, like all of those things working together helps sort of shake up the norm and help people open their mind a little bit more. Yeah. I don't know. Do you have any other ones, or
cool.
Chuck, do you have anything to add on that?
I could go on this for way too long, and I'm debating on how much to say about this
I'll
topic.
set a timer for 2 minutes.
I jokingly think I could do a half hour on this topic. This is one of those things that I'm fascinated by, and I might run. I'll run a slightly counter to it. Is that I feel like it's oftentimes the first thing people say in these kind of sessions. It's oftentimes the first thing moderators say in standard qual too. But it's a very, very tricky thing to live correctly, I think, because I see some people. We used to have this joke in grad school that we would call clowny, a clowny approach to things. Like some people try so hard to not be judgmental that they end up in this space that is just like jokey, funny. I'd bring a Twinkie to my desert island. But I think the hard line to walk is like, you don't want judgment, but you do want focus. And that the no judgment thing comes from this idea of we're focusing on whether let's for this case, let's say product, that we're thinking about a new product. We don't want to judge an idea that may be new or like we're certainly looking for new ideas product wise, right? But it's so hard sometimes to find people. And I do think, I think both of you really have this. That's one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you about this, Steve, because I think you do this really well, that you make people feel comfortable and you make them feel like their ideas won't be judged. But you don't go too far. Like we are trying to get something done, and it is so hard sometimes in these sessions to, especially if they go like multiple days, to stay focused on the topic at hand. And I think sometimes when I get most frustrated is when you see people that are trying so hard to be creative or not judgmental that they're kind of off in the forest, and they're not really focusing on the key product constraints we might be trying to get by or the difficult communication thing. They just kind of joke around. And I think that's a really hard balance to draw, is like, because at the end of the day, if I want to be real controversial, I will say you do need judgment. I mean, like, that's why you're in the room, right? You're someone that has like a set of skills that are, and we want your brain to be using that, but we don't want it to be shutting ideas down too early, right? Because that's key. I always think of these as happening in two phases, right? But in that first half, when you're in the expansion phase, you definitely want to be thinking outside the box, and it's a hard line to draw. I said too much about that, sorry.
No, you used 3 minutes, but we'll let you get away with that last 60 seconds. I was going to say too, I think that the judgment that I like to bring in to keep, I think there's a couple ways to keep people focused. I agree with you. It's a balance. But one of the things that we often bring into the conversation is sort of the consumer voice, and that's coming from the insights. And I do think that helps keep people sort of focused in on, you have this like really crazy idea, and then we come back and say, well, is that in any way grounded in the consumer insights that we heard about this topic? And I think that's a great way to keep people grounded and focused without being like, no, that's a bad idea, because we're letting the voice of the consumer help with the focus piece of it. And I'm guessing Steve has more to say on that, because I'm guessing that was his number 2 on his list of guidelines.
It was. I was going to go back quickly, though. I think that's the interesting role about being a moderator, is, Chuck, a little bit of what you're talking about is a good moderator is not just someone who runs through an agenda. It's not just delivering what you're going to say in a prescribed amount of time. It's also a bit of a leader that helps demonstrate what's within the scope or boundary. So if teams aren't necessarily being creative enough or pushing the edge, you can kind of come in and throw in those wild ideas to show, all right, there's some good places you can move into and expand your thinking a little bit more. But if they're being a little too overly creative, you can kind of coach them into a little bit more of that zone. And I think that's the art of being the moderator instead of just the tactical do. So that's the fun part.
I totally agree. I think that these sessions are both extremely fun and extremely challenging to moderate, because you have to be so flexible with kind of where the conversation is going while sticking to, some sort of framework so that you can actually accomplish what you have to accomplish in a given amount of time. And I think for the most part, as someone who writes the guides and moderates, all 3 of us have had that experience where you sort of prepare twice as much as you actually end up using, so that you can be really flexible and based on how the content is coming out. And you can be iterative with, hey, the discussion's going here. Do I have a way to sort of harness that creativity and energy in a meaningful way? And so the last time we did one of these, it was 2 days. At the end of the second day, I think I went to bed at around 8:00, because it was just such an exhausting experience, meaningful and wonderful. And I loved every moment of it, but it's exhausting. And it's because you have to be so reactive.
You made it look easy, though.
Well, thank you.
You definitely made it look easy.
It totally was. Any other kind of guidelines Steve, that you really are steadfast in keeping as you think through how to set up one of these sessions?
Yeah. One more basic one is I really like having no phones or computers sort of up and operating unless it's actually for the brainstorming. And the reasoning is that nothing kills a brainstorm like email. So if you're going along and if it starts to pull people away and be distracted, then you lose those voices and you lose the energy pretty quickly. It sort of deflates the sales, and sort of keeping those during prescribed times and putting in those breaks in order to have people do check their email. That's important, but not during the session. So that's just another small one, but more important than you'd think.
That's a hard one to enforce too. It is really hard to walk into a room of people who are very busy and time stretched to be like, hey, by the way, you can't look at your email for the next 2 hours. So that in and of itself can be a fight sometimes. So it's if you have any great tricks and tips on that one, we can talk offline.
I do think there's a growing awareness of that. Like, I love this whole, this movement in schools to get rid of. I think there's a growing awareness of how important that is to not have the devices. So it's getting to be an easier battle than it was a few years ago.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, because it is so easy to say, I can't remember that thing. I'm gonna choose your search engine of choice, and you look it up. Whereas if we take that device away, it does require people to use their brains and sort of flex those muscles. And I think because have been in a few years post-COVID of not really having to think as much about innovation and those types of things, because it's just sort of been like, we have to survive, we have to get product on the shelf. We've lost some of that ability to think creatively in an innovative way. And so it's interesting to see people flexing those muscles now, and how it is hard to do it without your phone sometimes, because you're used to being able to say, there's this product that I want to reference, or there's this cultural phenomenon going on that I want to show you. And if you don't have your phone there, you have to explain it, or you have to find another reference, or you have to be more creative even in your conversational skills, which I think is important, and hard to do sometimes. Yeah.
Totally
agree. I feel like you must have 6 or 7 more guidelines.
I do. Well, some of them, it's funny. I probably don't have that many, but I do think some of them, I know we're going to talk about different aspects of this, but I think that you've technically categorized this as another area, but I love the whole outsiders thing, which I don't know if now's the right time, or we could bring that up.
Go for it.
Because I know that you guys mentioned that earlier in your notes, that having an outside perspective on this, I think, is so good for everyone involved. And the outsider could be, someone relatively close, whether it's just a moderator or someone, or it could be really, one of my favorite of these that I ever did was, it was for a phone. It became a very successful product that people still use. And we brought in like 15 different outside perspectives. This is all about the physical design of the product, like what it looked like, how it felt. And we had the guy that designed the Batmobile was one of them. We had professors of architecture, people from completely unrelated fields that had never, there was a guy who would design like a famous Rolex watch. There are people who had experience in design but had never thought about how a phone would be designed. And it's just so interesting to hear people from other fields think about your thing, right? In terms of whether it's materials or just opportunities to kind of do things differently that you kind of had never even thought about, can really push the team to try different things. And I think that is like it sometimes seems like in the beginning planning phases, it's like, that'd be a hassle to find, but it's a hassle worth undertaking, I think, a lot of times, because they really can just really change perspective so quickly with just small comments and things they take for granted.
I think in addition to sort of like creative outsiders, there's also sort of what I would call more like, probably not an outsider, but professions that you would not think to bring in. So for instance, I always think it's fun to bring in like an illustrator. So if we're talking about ideas that we did this for a retailer once, where they were thinking about how to redesign a section within the store. And we were throwing out a whole bunch of ideas. And as we were doing it, the illustrator was drawing them on the fly. And then, the person whose idea it was could come over and say, no, I'd really like to have this there or that this way, or that's exactly how I imagined it. And from a creativity perspective, it was amazing, because you could actually, many of us are visual thinkers, right? I am myself. So to see something on the page drawn by someone who can do more than, my stick figures at the whiteboard was really cool. And then there was sort of a secondary benefit to that too, because it made it really easy to go test those concepts, right? We already had a drawing. And so there was sort of a streamlined continuity from start to finish where we could quickly get into field and get results on that. And I think it was really interesting. It was someone who, she was an illustrator. She had done something like this before, but she was definitely not a researcher. And it brought something really interesting to the discussion. And it wasn't, we had to find someone obviously and pay for their services, but it wasn't like this crazy lift that made it an unsurmountable hurdle for the future. And so I love doing that. And then I think you can also bring in like communication specialists or brand
copywriters. Yeah.
There's all sorts of people who have these skills that can add, sort of great nuances to the conversation, even if they don't even fully comprehend what the conversation is. So I always encourage that when there's time and budget. Even when there's not time and budget, I encourage it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I love bringing in that sort of outside opinion, and it's interesting because I've used it actually a couple different ways. One is in the sessions themselves, and they have that great voice, and I think that's what you guys are speaking to. But I've also sort of run a day of that before the workshops. So when you're having these sort of the consumer research share out and sort of level setting everybody on that same page, it is also going into the field, and we would visit all kinds of different people within their place. So cultural immersions, in order to sort of all have those experiences and ask sort of questions and level set. And they may not be part of the brainstorming that happens later, but it is really great to have that experience and start thinking about things differently. And it's a good setup for then going into those workshops to think differently. I had a great one.
I was actually not there for this one, but it was about being more sustainable. And the entire group went to a recycling center prior to like the actual place where they pull apart all the different materials. And they did that prior to the innovation and the brainstorming session. And I thought, how amazing is that to be really immersed in the smells and the textures and then have to come and, kind of be creative off of that. So I think that's a great use of time as well.
Yeah.
Sparked a lot of creativity.
Yeah.
And empathy. It sparked a lot of empathy.
Empathy. Yeah.
I think another thing on this topic that you guys have touched on, but we didn't clearly say, is where this happens, I think, is a big decision. And I think there's always this trade-off between like convenience and like sparking creativity. And you usually end up somewhere in the middle, because of everybody's time considerations. But I do think where it happens is it really does matter a lot, and the more you could pull people out of their everyday environment, to spark creativity, like going to a recycling center, but also just to get away from the distractions. And like, how often have we done this in someone's offices and, someone has an important question and pulls someone out and, that just happens all day long where someone sees someone and like, oh, I was meaning to follow up with you on that. And it's harder to kind of really focus, I think, that sometimes like having a quiet, tranquil space, there's less distractions. Like,
agreed. It also creates like a very special moment for the team. It creates like this team bonding moment that isn't the everyday. It sort of takes them and breaks that everyday routine, and it creates that bonding. So, back to the emails and so on, you don't have that readily available. It's more you're networking with the people that you're with immediately. And I think that can really help break that sort of everyday cycle that people are battling
sound
against.
Old, but I don't know if either of you watched that documentary on Apple TV about the Beatles, how they basically bring the Beatles to this like really like kind of rundown old warehouse and lock them in there for 2 weeks and they make an album. And it's like, it's really funny to think about like, oh, is this their process? They just like drop the warehouse had like, some rugs and their music equipment, but really, it didn't have much. Like I was just like, oh, they're just kind of, but it didn't have distractions and they're kind of locked in there for 2 weeks. And it's funny to see how they did that. Cause I think, there are parallels, right? Like anything creative, like there are certain kind of things and you do need to be able to focus, right? And it needs to feel a little bit like a different spot.
I think it would be scary to see what would come out of a warehouse if the three of us were locked in it for 2 weeks. So
Sharing would be brilliant, Maggie. It would be brilliant.
The first 2 hours would be brilliant. The rest would be like mayhem and survival.
This isn't a reflection on Steve, but it may be overly complicated if the two of us are left alone. Sure.
I feel like Steve is supportive and he would encourage our complication of things.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to watch from the outside. Yeah.
I totally agree that kind of shaking up the environment is really important. It is often not available to us, though. Do you have any sort of hacks or suggestions if you are limited to your day-to-day workspace? I know obviously we've talked about limit, no phones, no computers, all of that, taking that out of the environment. But anything else that y'all do that's really kind of helpful for, we're not stuck. We are limited to the corporate environment. How can we make it feel not routine?
Yeah, sure. So I think things like having an agenda that's sort of very clearly outlined, that sort of clearly states that we're here, this is what we're trying to achieve. It kind of, it creates walls to say this is a 2-hour or 2-day workshop, for example. I think also having that leadership buy-in and communicate that and be that representative of I am not checking my phone. I am here for the 2 days, and communicating that to the rest of the team can also sort of set those guidelines. And then with the space that you have, if there's anything you can do to make it feel different. So is it moving tables around? Is it bringing in different furniture? Is it providing breakfast and lunch for everybody? Is it having is there workspace or floor if you're in a high rise, or a different building if you have multiple buildings? I've even done it in people's houses. So anything that can make it feel just slightly different than what it was, and that this is a unique experience to be part of and to be engaged in, really helps.
Break people up into groups and send them outside too. Like, you know what I mean? You guys go over, like, you could still be on the campus, but just send them out of their normal area. You know what I mean? And kind of move around throughout the day. I think kind of is the poor man's version of that. That works pretty well.
I feel like advice that Chuck gave me long ago that I continue to think about is just sort of like put a lot of stuff on the walls, and it comes out more eloquently than that in execution, but it's sort of like put stimuli up there that sort of stimulates the brain, or that causes someone to think like about a different environment, even if they are in a more corporate environment. And I think
yeah, you feel immersed in the experience. If you have lots of quant research that's all surrounded by you, you feel integrated with it.
One of the things that I find a lot is that clients often expect, consumers to solve these types of problems. And I don't think that's the case, but I think bringing in a lot of their voice into these conversations is really important, because it does sort of start to spark things, sort of, hey, if they have this need, I can meet it with this and that type of thing. So I love the idea of bringing in, whether it's quotes or videos or still images of, text messages, whatever it is, that kind of reminds the group like, hey, we're here to solve for this. This is the consumer that we are answering to during this conversation. And the more we can sort of bring that to life, I do think that helps shake up the environment a little bit, because as creative as some of these corporate campuses are, they're still corporate campuses. And the more we can bring people to them, the better.
Yeah. I agree. And I think encouraging people to use the consumer's voice in their communication can be really helpful. A lot of times when sharing research or insights and people are sharing what feels like their perspective, it creates an opportunity for, again, people to judge and have different opinions. But when you lead with the consumer's voice and you say the consumer said this, or they heard this, and as a result, it takes out that question if it's somebody's judgment, but it's actually from the consumer, and you can sort of help solve the problem together. So agreed, even in the language, that's really helpful.
So another thing that I think about a lot, or a question that I would have for y'all, is this: do you know from kind of, or at what point do you know if one of these sessions is going to be successful, or how successful it's going to be? Like, are there marks or, sort of signs that, hey, this one's going to go well, versus, oh, this one's going to be more of a challenge?
I'd say a few things on that. I think I think one of the biggest, let's call it flags you get, is you can tell how motivated people are by how willing they are to get out of their day-to-day routine, right? To take on it's so these things are a hassle beforehand to set up for success, right? You could see some people want to do it, but then every idea is like, no, that's too much work. No, that's too much work. No, I just wanted to, I've got a conference room off my office. We'll just do it there. No, I just got these 5 people and then we don't need to break. Like when they start saying no to everything different, you kind of get a sense of like, okay, this is going to be hard to break through this. And I think the people that do this well, like I said, they're I think you have to be focused on the problem, and you have to be really trying to break free of whatever is holding you back. But you're willing to be creative and have fun with it, right? Like, okay, let's try this. What if we try this? Like people that are more willing to try things, I think, generally get there, and are surprised by how much progress they can make in a day or two. Sometimes, sometimes it is shocking. You're like, oh, this is actually pretty good, and it's like. It's always funny to me as an outsider to see something that was kind of not there. We went somewhere for 2 days, we worked on it, and then the thing that launched is basically where we were at the end of the second day. Like there's not, it may be a year later that you see it, but or 6 months later. But it's funny that, you can make a lot of progress, but it does require setting aside, turning off your email, bringing in people, be willing to try different things, and focus your attention.
Yeah. Kind of building on that, that idea of research and going into it, there is the building of the right teams of people. So if you have multiple groups, being able to set up the right energy levels, one of the things that I find probably the best indicator is if it's like a volume dial, people that are operating at kind of a 7 to 8 on average, that seems like the right place that's going to deliver what you need, that you can be expansion thinking and then also sort of narrow down and dot vote into what your favorite ideas are. A group of 10s ends up going everywhere, right? And a group of 3s, they never make any progress because there's no judgment. So trying to find that right mix of people that averages out to that 7 to 8 is right about the right volume. And I see the most success.
What do you think our average volume is on this podcast?
I feel like I always operate at 10. So I'm trying not to be a 10.
I know, right? I agree with both of you. One of my biggest flags is when you present hey, this is going to take us 2 days, right? This is the agenda. And the person comes back and says, well, I have 3 hours. To me, that's sort of like, oh no, this is going to be a disaster. That's definitely one. And then the other one, and there's sort of a spectrum for this one, is when someone is overly involved in planning the agenda, I worry that they don't trust us enough to be flexible and creative. And when someone is under involved in planning the agenda, I worry that they're not engaged enough. So it's finding someone who is engaged in kind of understanding how the agenda works and has creative ideas and thoughts and wants to have input into it, but not someone who is kind of trying to plan it down to the minute. I think there needs to be some level of the client trusting the moderator and the team that's coming in, so that it can sort of organically go where the thoughts take it. So those are my two watch outs, I guess. And the ones that I find are the most successful, or the ones that I'm most excited about, is when someone comes in and is kind of like, I have all these ideas and I'm ready. And, where they're excited to get a pre-assignment for it, or they're kind of, chomping at the bit, so to speak, to sort of dive into what the day holds. And those I get really excited about. And that may be an indicator that we've got a 10 on our hands, but I would take a 10 over a 3 in that scenario.
Yeah. I think what you also bring up is that oftentimes that's solving real problems. I've also been in some workshops that aren't solving real problems. They're kind of more team building exercises than they are necessarily like clear challenges that the business is having that they're going to actually implement and move forward with. And you get those people at that 8 to 10, as you're talking about, if they have something that's actual that they need to solve, and there is some urgency to make that happen. Yeah. Can be really helpful.
Agreed. All right. Now I want to hear about sort of your peaks and valleys I feel like I do this with my kids at the end of the day at the table, sort of like what went well and what didn't, or what's your rose and your thorn. But do you have any sort of stories where you're like, hey, this was amazing, or conversely ones where you're like, oh, this one did not go well? So if you have any you'd like to share, I would love to hear them. I will place the caveat that I forget all bad things that happen in my career, so I don't have any horror stories to share.
I'm happy to share a horror story then. I remember
that's probably a better way to grow than mine. I just suppress them.
So for me, this is one that this is a workshop I wasn't leading, but I was part of, but was a good learning lesson where I was basically at a conference and people were sharing different research that had been performed with about 100 people. And the people out in the audience were asked to sort of use sticky notes to write down what those key learnings are and what might, potential opportunities be. And so after a day of presentations or so, the teams ended up the audience ended up breaking out into teams, and there were about 5 teams of 20 people, and each of those 20 people had approximately 20 sticky notes, and the teams were prescribed to basically bring all of those sticky notes together, create those themes that we're seeing and what those sort of opportunities are in the future. But as you can imagine, 20 people with 20 sticky notes, 400 sticky notes on a board, trying to share that with everybody, trying to corral everybody to listen, and actually then create those themes was really hard. And you can see it went largely probably off the rails. And it could have been better, but that's one of my favorite sort of cautionary tales about having too many people with too many ideas.
It's funny. There's almost like a chart where the more people you have, I was in one of these with 300 people. The more people you have, the more extremely structured every minute has to be to do it well. Like the guy that I didn't, yeah. I kind of ran the one with 300 people, but there was someone else that played a really big role. And he was so type A, and it works for 300 people, but it wouldn't work for 12 really. Like, so that was kind of like his specialties, really big ones. But it's really, you have to kind of match up that. It's hard to it's almost like there are different processes, right? Like depending on the size and the scale, that can be really hard. It can be, because these things can go to, it's a little bit like being a teacher. It can go to chaos real quick. If you know what I mean? Like if you let it's hard because people, it does require, like when you're learning something or focusing on something, it requires a lot of attention, a lot of like focus that people will naturally want to shift away from. It's a little bit like a mental workout, right? But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
I think I had a little bit of an anxiety attack thinking about all those sticky notes. They're all stuck everywhere, and it's like my nightmare.
It still haunts me.
I think you both raise an excellent point that highlights how sort of customized these need to be as you develop them, depending on who's in the room, what you're solving for, who the client is, all of that. So it's interesting to think through all the complexity. And while we're sitting here being like, these are the guidelines, there are no two of these that are ever the same. And I think that's what's fascinating and challenging about it.
You know, that's funny too. It also depends a lot on the culture of the company, right? Like I did a couple of these that were really, really large early in my career, like 100 people that were at more traditional companies. And if we tried that at a company, Meta or one of the tech companies, they would just be like, what are you doing? Like it just would never work. So it has to fit the culture of the company as well. So there's kind of a lot of moving pieces here that are hard to, yeah.
Totally agree.
Did you have any other success stories or disaster stories, Steve?
So success stories, I think one of the more interesting ones, it's not necessarily in the output, but the actual delivery of it. As you said earlier, and I truly believe in, that every workshop ends up being unique and different. And you build that workshop in order to meet the needs of whatever situation you're in. And one of the ones I'm probably most proud of is I was responsible for a lot of the data of this project. And I had to share that with stakeholders in a way that they were going to absorb that data and then take action off of it. And these workshops typically aren't filled with huge amounts of data. And so trying to figure out how to get people to understand it and then take action was kind of hard. So I built this workshop similar to what we're talking about, where I took basically 6 of the most important infographics or charts, and I blew them up on big boards. And then I had this level setting moment of, hey, here's what this data is, and here's a bit of what it's saying, but then ran through the workshop with it and said, all right, what are you seeing in the data? What stands out to you? And everybody would sort of share with Post-it notes on these big boards of what was unique. And then once we had that, we sort of brainstormed what could solves be to some of those challenges. And to me, that was, again, very different than what I've done in the past, but really a fun experiment, and good that you can see that you can do it with data.
We did a big one year. I actually forgot about this too. You just talking about it, because I used to think about this a lot, and I just kind of went away back there. But we did this one where it was for a segmentation, and we had these immersion rooms for each of the segments, and people would spend a couple hours in each room, and there would be exercises. There was this whole thing that went on for 2 days. But the output of it went up into the company lobby, and it stayed there for 3 years. Do you remember that, Maggie? It's funny. I actually totally forgot. I used to tell clients that story all the time, and I totally forgot about it. I was like, that was so cool.
Thank you. I forgot about it, but that's a great one.
That's
I totally forget everything. But yeah, it was really cool. There's some of these. It is interesting, because I've been in some of these that I would definitely label disasters. And I do think the most common reason for it, when I see it, a disaster is way too strong of a word. But there are sometimes when they're a waste of time. And I think the most common reason they're a waste of time is being too frivolous and not focused enough on what the success hurdle is. What are we trying to do here? You know what I mean? But the ones that work could take a lot of different forms. I've seen some really large structured ones work, and I've seen some really small groups come up with, a really, really great output. If you have the right people, and they could, it's so much of it is that the people gelling and engaging in the process, right? And,
I think. Oh, sorry. I was going to say one of the things, and I think, Steve, you actually brought this up the last time when we were working together this last time. And it was sort of this idea of hey, what are sort of the new tools that might come into the conversation? And one of the things you've mentioned is is there a way we can use some AI tools to kind of, as part of the creative process here? And so I think that there's even though it kind of goes back to this, there's no one way to solve for these. I think that we're continually finding innovative ways to bring new things into the conversation, new ways to sort of spark creativity. And it's all still rooted in this idea that there's a need to be solved, and the company needs to come up with the right way to solve that problem that fits within the, sort of consumer need and the business abilities. But I do think that these are so fun because they're never the same, and we keep finding new ways to be creative and to challenge brands and consumers to think about things differently. And that's why I love them so much, even though we don't do them every day, right? It's not like I'm working on one of these projects constantly, but when they come up, I think they're so, they're challenging for us, right? They're challenging on many levels, but it's really interesting to see what comes out of them. And like Chuck said, there are many times when you look at a shelf or you see an ad or a campaign, you're like, wait a minute, that's from our session, and it's really rewarding to work on these types of projects.
I do think too, to kind of circle back to what you said at the beginning, that there is, because things move so much faster now, and there's so many things going on. It's so so many kind of things that distract from people's attention. There is more of a need now to intentionally, almost mindfully focus on what the output of these learnings are going to be with research, right? Like you do have to set aside time now and really kind of say, hey, listen, and I think it does fall more on the research than it used to be, because people are so busy and they're moving in so many different directions. And so it seems like there's more of a need for this than ever. And it reminds me of mindfulness, where like, as the world gets busier, you have to intentionally disconnect and intentionally focus on what you're trying to do, and say, okay, what's the next step for this? What we've got all these learnings. What is the what's the appropriate next step for the business or the company or the product or whatever it is we're focusing on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like there's a lot of companies are becoming very specialized, or people's roles are become specialized within companies where more in the past or more in the startup, you're doing lots of different roles, where the more specified different roles have become, the more you need to bring them together for moments like this to be able to share and have that collective moment, rather than necessarily being the day-to-day operations if you're a 3-person team or a 4-person team total. We're now needing that in these bigger organizations.
I don't know if you guys have the same experience, but it makes me feel old when I think about how different presentations felt early in my career than they feel now, in the sense that, I would, for the same size research project or business problem, I would regularly fly somewhere and have a whole half day, and I would get peppered with a million questions. And people, like, sometimes there'd be like 80 or 100 people in these rooms, and everyone would have questions, and that would spark discussion. It would go around. And it's so crazy to me now that it's been years since I've felt anything like that at a presentation. Like, if there's usually not as many people, half of them are on Zoom and don't have any questions. And so maybe they absorbed everything. I don't know, but there's none of that afterwards part where people are like, oh, that's interesting. And they start going back and forth with each other. And I do think that there's something missing there a little bit that needs to be brought into the kind of current work style.
I agree.
Yeah, I think the speed of work also is contributing to that, where everybody is expected to produce more and more and more, and that may not give you the time to think about things. And that's sort of what I'm hearing from you is that just that freedom to think about what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, et cetera. They're just on the go mode, rather than being able to flip it off every once in a while. And it's now have these forced moments to do that, where it was more readily available in the past and encouraged.
I think consumers are starting to demand it more too. We're coming out of this period where it really has been, for a lot of businesses, like, you just have to survive. You have to get product on the shelf. There's more demand. There's not enough supply. Like, we're solving for these very tactical issues, and that left no time to think about innovation or, in some cases, even strategy. And so now there's this void in a lot of innovation pipelines where, because companies were correctly focused on getting products to shelves or to solving very immediate and different needs than we'd had to solve in many years. And so that the right thing was done at the right time. But now it's leaving this place where it's like, hey, we do need to sit back and we need to think about, how have consumers changed? What do they need? And consumers are suffering from, you're putting the same thing on the shelf, but it's costing me more. And, I don't have as much disposable income anymore. So, I need something more. And I think it's going to create this real need for what exactly both of you were talking about. You have to pause, you have to think, we have to solve bigger problems now, because, we haven't done it in a while. And so we're going to have to, use our creative muscles more, and we're going to have to make time for these types of things. And I think it'll be really rewarding, though, if done correctly. And it can be kind of exciting too. So I know that we have it's been really fun to talk to both of you and to sort of get to sit and think for a while. I always like to throw out sort of at the end, like, hey, is there anything else you want to say on the topic? And I believe that both of you could say more, but is there anything that you're dying to say before we, Chuck is raising his hand even.
No, I was doing.
Oh, okay. Got it.
I said too much, Maggie. I must bow out. Leave them wanting more.
I love it. Steve, I hope you will come back and join us again. It's been fabulous. You fit in perfectly with our style. So we are looking forward to finding another topic to chat with you about.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to talk about this or anything else. Happy to come
back. Maybe we'll find that warehouse for 2 weeks and see what kind of podcasts come out of that.
I can tell you the music that comes out of it will not be good.
Oh, no.
At least from my perspective.
You know what? I found 3 guitars in my house the other day. I can't play any of them. So it's going to be terrible. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Until next time.